Greetings and welcome. Today we're taking a closer look at the existence and the nature and recruitment and ideologies of right-wing extremist groups and especially violent groups in the United States. This is a map produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it shows the extent in 2021 of the existence of hate groups all over the United States, including Michigan. There are a good number of hate groups located in Michigan, but the whole country is home to a variety of different kinds of extremist right-wing hate groups, some of which are avowedly violent. You've done some reading of materials that I've collected, especially from a Stanford University center that tracks extremism and hate groups in the United States. And so you've read about the Proud Boys, the Base, the Oath Keepers. As people living in Michigan, you are already familiar with the Wolverine Watchmen who were recently convicted of attempting to, or plotting, conspiring to kidnap the governor of the state of Michigan. If you go back a while, you'll think of the occupation with armed force of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in the state of Oregon. Timothy McVeigh's 1995 bomb attack, which killed dozens of people in Oklahoma City. The Charlottesville riots, which we have talked about previously, and of course the 2021 January 6th insurrection at the Capitol building. Something that you haven't read, but I've referred to before, is a book by Cynthia Miller Idris, and her book is called Hate in the Homeland. And what she has done, it's really remarkable research, but she has done extensive research on extremist mobilization and ideology and the ways in which young people especially, and young men in particular, are recruited into extremist and sometimes violent groups within the United States. And many of her findings are highly relevant to our concerns in the course. And we've talked about some of those, the use of cultural elements like clothing, dress, style, cooking, and mixed martial arts clubs, all as being ways of getting access to young people, young adults, and especially young men, and bringing them into the ideology and eventually the organizations of far-right organizations. There's kind of an underlying, I suppose you could call it a social theory, which many of these groups share, which is referred to as accelerationist theory. But it is the idea that groups can act very provocatively and violently, taking actions which would accelerate open violence and provoke civil war or race war in the United States. One outlet that we've seen of this ideology in recent months is the outbreak of attacks on electric power transformers with high-powered rifles and substations to disable parts of the electric grid. And attacks in near Baltimore have now been investigated, and the persons responsible were specifically trying to stimulate race war by taking down part of the electric grid. So here's a quote from Miller Idris about accelerationist ideology. At the most extreme fringe, far-right extremists not only believe that a violent apocalypse is coming, but also argue that the best and fastest way to reach the phase of rebirth is to accelerate the path to the apocalypse and eventual new world order by speeding up polarization and societal discord as a way of undermining social stability overall. Violence is foundational to this approach because violent acts create immediate societal panic, inspire copycat actors, and encourage reciprocal or revenge terror attacks from affected groups. For this reason, each violent act of terror is viewed as a heroic act celebrated in the name of the global cause and is understood to bring white supremacists one step closer to the end times collapse and subsequent restoration of a new white civilization. This principle, acceleration, is a key aspect of motivating terrorist violence from the far right. As is evident from this quotation and also much of the reading that you've done for today, right-wing extremists are often willing to threaten the use of violence and to actually make use of violence in support of their ideologies. And as is evident from discussions we've had already in the course, the appeal to violence in politics is an inherently anti-democratic mechanism or strategy, because it specifically works against the idea of the rule of law, of decision-making by peaceful processes involving democratic decision-making. Many of the groups that you've read about, including the Three Percenters and the other groups that you read about for today, many of those groups are motivated by beliefs about white supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-immigrant bigotry, and anti-LGBTQ bigotry. And the language which is used by the leaders and the spokespersons of these groups on social media, YouTube, and other internet-based channels is virulent and unashamed. And Miller Idris has done a good job of identifying some of those statements, and you also see them in the readings that I collected for you for today. One of the motivating factors for some of the most extreme groups, the most prone to violence, is an anti-government ideology, anti-government activism, and a willingness to use violence against government and against the agents of government. Armed militias, like what we have here in Michigan, but also in many other states in the country, are often motivated by extreme antagonism to the federal government and to state governments. And we can recall these various incidents going back to the 1990s and the Timothy McVeigh bombing in Oklahoma City, but all the way up to the violent invasion and insurrection of the US Capitol on January 6th, 2021. So Miller Idris is very interested in the question of how are extremists brought into an active, engaged willingness to be a part of a group which espouses violence, espouses racism, espouses anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And a number of her observations, I think, are very important for us to understand. Here's a quote from Miller Idris. "In this light, the efforts of organized far-right groups to engage with young people in the spaces and places described in this book, combat sports and mixed martial arts clubs, music scenes, YouTube cooking channels, college campuses, and a variety of youth-oriented online spaces like gaming chat rooms or social media platforms are especially important, these youth-oriented spaces. Far-right groups have always worked to recruit young people to their movements and politicize youth spaces like concerts, festivals, youth-oriented events, and music lyrics. These are sometimes referred to as youth scenes, a word that reflects a less hierarchical and a more disorganized structure than traditional social movements. If you recall the German ethnography of going to a far-right neo-Nazi concert, this description from Miller Idris is very familiar. Another quote that I think is very important from Miller Idris: "Decades of research on far-right youth culture has shown how particular facets of subcultures and youth scenes like hate music can spread intolerance and prejudice against minorities, not only in expected genres like right-wing hard rock and black metal, but also in more mainstream genres like country and pop music. In the same way, hate clothing can expose consumers to extremist opinions, nudging ideological views on immigration, religion, violence, and gun control towards the extremist fringe, while opening the door to further engagement and more dangerous actions. Brands marketing hate offer legitimacy, signal membership, and promote ideology to far-right insiders. Far-right clothing also acts as an icebreaker for youth to strike up conversations in school stadiums, bars, and at parties when they recognize someone across the room wearing, quote, an insider brand. So on the question of how young people are mobilized, again, quoting from Miller-Idriss, far-right youth today might initially encounter extremist narratives through chance encounters in mainstream spaces like the MMA, a campus auditorium, a podcast, or a YouTube video. Each of those mainstream spaces, however, can act as a channel, opening the door to dedicated far-right MMA festivals, alt-tech platforms, and encrypted communications platforms, and dedicated YouTube subscriptions that mix mainstream interest in cooking or music with far-right ideology. Understanding these new spaces and places, the geography of hate, is key to comprehending the far-right in its modern form. So she's making an important point here that mobilization of extremist, far-right, and violent groups and supporters of such groups is fairly different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century for the mobilization for fascism and Nazi ideology. She believes that mixed martial arts clubs and gyms provides an incubator for the far right. It helps to recruit new youth to the movement from adjacent subcultures, introducing key far-right messages about discipline, resistance to the mainstream, and apocalyptic battles. She also makes the point that MMA plays into the kind of, I suppose you could call it toxic masculinity, which is a part of the ideology of far-right extremism. And I think we saw some of that in the video that we watched a few weeks ago on the Charlottesville rioting. These young men who were just really reveling in making use of their clubs and their threatening gestures and their torches to frighten and intimidate and beat demonstrators that they didn't agree with. She also makes an important point about the normalization of hate and white supremacy. If the ideologies of racism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, if these were just tiny extremist currents that people rarely heard about and were ashamed to talk about, that would be one thing. But what she notes is that there has been a real normalization of the language of hate, the discourses of hate and white supremacy, anti-Semitism, at the very highest levels. Political leaders, unfortunately, the former president, engaging in this kind of rhetoric, and quoting from her, the normalization of far-right and white supremacist ideas is an example of the normalization of extremism. Continuing the quote, ideological beliefs once thought to be extreme have, with relative speed, become more widely accepted by the general public. This is what people refer to as the mainstreaming of extremism, the process through which previously extreme ideas become normalized as part of the acceptable spectrum of beliefs within democratic society. And yet, as democratic citizens, all of us should recognize this is not a legitimate discourse. Being overtly or even covertly anti-Semitic, engaging in hate statements about Jews or Muslims or LGBTQ people or trans people, these are expressions of hate, and they're specifically designed to mobilize other people to come together and to use various means, including violent means, against the objects of those racist beliefs. But she also finds that extremism exists on college campuses. A very interesting quote taken from students at Syracuse University goes along these lines. Propaganda, white supremacist flyers, racist graffiti, and provocative speaking tours have brought hate to campuses across the country in new ways, exposing hundreds of thousands of students to far-right ideologies. This kind of hate intimidates and threatens members of vulnerable groups, unsettles campus climates, and creates significant anxiety around student safety and well-being. Students at Syracuse University who staged a sit-in in November 2019 following more than a dozen hate incidents at the university told journalists that they didn't feel safe on campus. Quoting from a student, "I absolutely do not feel safe here, and I think a large number of students also don't feel safe here." One student told Anderson Cooper on CNN, noting, again quoting from this person, "I personally, and I know I speak for a lot of people when I say I don't even feel safe walking back to my own residence hall." So Miller Idris is concerned about the fact that the normalization of hate speech, the normalization of hate-based ideology, white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-LGBTQ bigotry, that the normalization of these hate-based ideas has gone from extremist channels on YouTube to a presence and a kind of mainstream presence on college campuses, and this is a very disturbing sign. So what are the lessons that we can learn from taking a quick look at the existence of violent far-right extremists in the United States today? There are a couple of important lessons. First of all, the use of violence in political protest is inherently anti-democratic. It represents an effort to impede the workings of a democratic government, and it works to intimidate ordinary citizens. Charlottesville 2017 was a clear example of citizen intimidation, but the kind of intimidation that was referred to by the Syracuse University student is just as important and just as concerning for all of us who care about democratic values, inclusion, equality of all citizens, and a political order based on the rule of law. So thank you. I hope we'll have a good discussion this week of far-right extremism.